Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be stitching up the Live Life in Full Bloom embroidery pattern. This is available on my Etsy shop as a PDF pattern, and feel free to stitch along with me. So right now I am just transferring my pattern onto some cotton fabric using the carbon paper method. And because this fabric is quite thin, I am doubling it up. And using my 8-inch hoop, I just stretched my fabric into the hoop. Starting off with the text, I'm just stitching that up using a back stitch and using quite small stitches because we want to try to retain that detail on this text outline. I am using only 2 strands of thread here to try and retain that detail. For this flower here, I'm using a petal stitch, basically making a stitch and coming out in the middle of it. Using a pin to mark the top of where we want our petal stitch to finish, and wrapping my thread around the top of the needle and then back down through that first stitch we made to anchor the wrap. And the amount of wraps I'm making here is variable depending on the size of the area you want to fill. Once you're happy with the density of the petal stitch, I'm going through the center of all the wraps with my needle, and before pulling through I am just wrapping my working thread around my needle to then make a knot. With the petals that are cut off by the banner, stitch in a couple of satin stitches just to kind of fill in that space. And then with the outer petals, I'm just using a sort of salmon coloured pink, I guess, thread to make those petal stitches, and these are going to end up being quite a bit bigger, so using more wraps. And with the bigger petal stitches, if they're not quite laying where you want them to, I just add a couple of stitches to hold it down, I guess. I noticed there's a couple of gaps between the petal stitches, so I just like to go in and add a couple of stitches to kind of fill it out a little bit. Moving on to the next flower, we're just going to be using a satin stitch to fill this one out. And I'm using 6 strands here, so it's going to build up quite quickly. Make sure all your satin stitches are nicely close together, and if you need to sort of layer them a little bit, that makes for a nice full look. And for this flower, again, I'm using a satin stitch with 6 strands of thread and stitching that all up. Moving on to the leaves, I'm using a fishbone stitch, again with 6 strands of thread. So starting at the tip of our leaf, I'm just making that center stitch and then going along each side of that line and coming into the center. Sort of like crisscrossing and using that first stitch as a guide. And with the smaller leaves, I halved my thread count, so I have 3 strands of thread here and I'm just stitching them in the same way. I really love it when I stitch the leaves in an embroidery piece. It just makes it look so full and alive. Yeah. Alright, so moving on to these buds here, I'm just going to be satin stitching these, and I'm just kind of filling them in and kind of following those leaf shapes that we filled in and just stitching around those. And here as well we've got a little bud. I'm stitching in some purple thread. And over here as well. Just look how quickly it like fills up when you use 6 strands. It's like so satisfying. Next we're stitching in these small sort of filler flowers, and again I'm using that petal stitch we used on that big flower to sort of echo that texture of the first flower into the rest of the embroidery piece, if that makes sense. So using that petal stitch again to fill out these petal shapes. And I'm using 3 strands here, so it's not too bulky. Next we want to stitch in these sort of wheat stems, so I'm going to be using an outline stitch for the center, so coming up and then back down to make a stitch, and then before pulling all the way through you want to come through the middle of that stitch and then pull tight, going back down to make another stitch before pulling all the way through, come back to where that first stitch ended and then pull through. When I'm stitching curves like this, I like to leave my loop of thread that I leave behind with the curve, so it makes for a nice line, if that makes sense. And then for the little sort of wheat puffs, I will be using a chain stitch, a single chain stitch. So coming out and then back through, and then sort of catching that loop and pulling tight, and then going back down through the fabric. Again, coming through where you want your stitch to start and then back down, leaving that loop and then catching where you want the stitch to end, pulling through and then making that stitch to secure that loop. But just filling in these with different colors. Next we are going to be using that outline stitch to fill in all the sprigs and stems of this embroidery piece. So kind of connecting a lot of the elements together with this stitch, and this colour sort of like a deep brown, and also stitching in these sort of baby's breath sprigs as well that we're going to sort of stitch in later. So just kind of making the outline of the branches. I'm also using just a simple straight stitch to add a center to the leaves. This is optional, but I thought it would look quite nice. Making little French knots to create the baby's breath, and I'm wrapping my thread around my needle around 3 or 4 times, keeping a nice tight grip makes for a good clean looking French knot. And just being creative with this and kind of, you know, free-flowing, sort of adding as much or as little as you like, but just being a bit, you know, whimsical with it makes it look quite free and organic. And I'm using French knots to add a stamen into all of the little filler flowers that we did earlier. I'm using 6 strands of sort of an orangey yellow, an option is to use these French knots to fill in the main flower stamens, but I chose to sort of add a bit of embellishment with these seed beads. I think this will just change it up a little bit. So just taking some regular sewing thread, I am placing all of these little seed beads into the center, one at a time. And the last step is to add a border around our little banner for the text. I am using a chain stitch for this. And that's it. Live Life in Full Bloom embroidery is complete. Whether or not you follow along and stitch with me, I hope that you found this video relaxing and enjoyable. And I hope to see you very soon. Okay? Take care. Bye.